The winter of 1941 had settled over Kiev like a heavy grey curtain, muting the city's usual chatter. Snow lay thick on cobblestone streets, softening the harsh lines of buildings scarred by time and neglect. On the surface, life seemed ordinary. Street vendors haggling over vegetables, children laughing as they skated on frozen ponds, and trams rattling along icy tracks. But beneath this fragile calm, a storm was brewing, one that would engulf the city and change it forever. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a student of history at Kiev University, walked briskly across the courtyard, her satchel heavy with books and notebooks. She had always been a quiet observer, preferring the company of dusty manuscripts to crowded classrooms. History, with its sweeping tales of conquest and resistance, had always fascinated her. She read not merely to know the past, but to understand the human spirit, its triumphs, its follies, and its moments of quiet courage. But that winter, the past no longer felt distant. Rumors of the advancing German army reached even the quietest corners of the city. Families whispered of villages burned, entire towns erased, and soldiers marching with brutal precision. Lyudmila had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the tension in her father's shoulders, and though she tried to focus on her studies, she could not ignore the tremor of history arriving at Kiev's doorstep. The city changed almost overnight. Air raid sirens wailed, shattering the cold morning silence, sending citizens scurrying for cover in basements and cellars. Smoke began to curl over the horizon, thin at first, but growing darker with each passing day. Windows shuttered, streets emptied, and the once lively marketplaces became ghostly avenues. Kiev, with its proud golden domes and broad boulevards, had become a city on the edge of despair. Lyudmila's life fractured along with the city. The lecture halls that had once echoed with debate were now filled with fear and hushed murmurs. Her friends spoke in whispers about relatives lost to bombings, neighbors deported, or those who had vanished altogether. And then, one morning, the war came to her doorstep. It was her history professor who first spoke of it, a man whose calm demeanor had always reassured her. "The Germans are coming. Kiev will not hold. You must prepare for what is to come." The words sank into her mind, like stones into deep water, disturbing the sediment of her young life. She understood, with a sudden clarity, that the world she had known, filled with classrooms, libraries, and quiet afternoons, was gone. And yet, in the chaos, Lyudmila felt a stirring she could not name. It was not merely fear. It was something sharper, something that demanded action. She could not remain an observer any longer. Every tale she had read of the past, of resistance fighters, of soldiers who had stood alone against impossible odds, resonated with her now. The history she had studied was no longer abstract. It was alive, brutal, and pressing upon her like the icy wind that whipped through Kiev's streets. Her transformation began quietly. She scavenged what weapons she could find, old rifles hidden in barns or abandoned by retreating soldiers. She read manuals by candlelight, learning the mechanics of firearms with a meticulous precision that surprised even herself. Her hands, once accustomed to the delicate turning of pages, became steady and sure, guided by a newfound purpose. She practiced in secret, on the outskirts of the city, moving silently through the snow, her breath forming clouds that mingled with the misty winter air. Even then, she was still human, still fragile. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake in her cramped room, listening to distant explosions, counting the seconds between bursts of gunfire, and imagining faces she had yet to confront, faces of men trained to kill, unaware that a young student watched them, learning, waiting, calculating. Fear and determination wrestled within her, but with each passing day, the scales tipped toward resolve. She would not run. She would not hide. She would fight. The first days of the German occupation were a blur of terror. Soldiers marched through the streets, their boots stamping authority into the cobblestones. Families were torn from their homes, lined up against walls, and forced to witness unspeakable acts. Lyudmila moved through this nightmare with careful observation, memorizing the routines of the enemy, noting the patterns of patrols, the sounds of boots on metal, the cadence of orders barked across the frozen streets. Every detail mattered. Every observation would later become a tool of survival and resistance. Her friends, frightened and bewildered, implored her to flee, to hide, to take the safer path. But Lyudmila's mind was already set. History, she realized, was not made by those who waited for safety. It was made by those who acted, even when every instinct screamed to do otherwise. And so she began her transformation fully, stepping from the shadows of ordinary life into the frozen battlefield of Kiev, a city that was no longer hers alone, but a stage for courage, fear, and the forging of legends. By the time the first snow fell thick and heavy, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer simply a student. She was a witness, a learner, and soon a fighter. Every silent street, every shuttered window, every echoing footstep became part of her education in war. She learned to move without being seen, to breathe without betraying her presence, and to observe the enemy not as a faceless soldier, but as a vulnerability, a pattern, a life she would confront with unflinching focus. In the nights that followed, Kiev seemed to hold its breath, and in that quiet, broken only by distant gunfire and the whisper of falling snow, Lyudmila Pavlichenko began to emerge, a shadow in the winter, poised to leave an indelible mark on history, one precise, deliberate action at a time. The storm was coming, and she would meet it with eyes wide open, a rifle in her hands, and a resolve forged in the cold crucible of war. The winter of 1941 deepened into a merciless freeze. Kiev, once a city of light and laughter, now groaned under the weight of war. Smoke curled from distant fires like black fingers clawing at the sky. Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked through streets lined with shuttered shops and shuttered lives, her breath steaming in the icy air. Each footstep crunched against frost-hardened snow, the sound strangely loud in the eerie quiet that had claimed the city. She had long known that the war would come for her. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for the first taste of fear in its rawest form. She remembered the day clearly. The horizon glowed orange, not from sunrise but from the fires consuming the outskirts of the city. The sharp bark of rifles shattered the morning air. She ducked behind a collapsed wall, heart hammering, eyes wide with disbelief, as neighbors, friends, and strangers fell victim to the invading forces. The reality of the war was brutal, chaotic, and immediate. It was in that chaos that something inside her shifted. The fear, rather than paralyzing her, ignited a spark of determination. She refused to be swept away by history as a passive observer. She would act. She would fight. Lyudmila sought out the Soviet defenders, her resolve unwavering despite her lack of formal military experience. The men she approached, hardened by months of fighting, laughed at first. A young woman, barely more than a girl, could not possibly withstand the horrors of the front line. She was told to return home, to study, to survive. But survival without action was not enough. Her eyes, cold and unwavering, told a story they could not dismiss. She was assigned a small rifle, an old Mosin Nagant that had seen better days. Its metal was scratched, its wood chipped, but in her hands it became an extension of her own will. Under the bitter supervision of a veteran sniper, she learned the basics: sighting, breathing, trigger control. Yet her true education came not from lessons, but from observation. She watched soldiers falter under pressure, noted the enemy's habits, memorized the timing of patrols. Her mind, trained by years of academic study, now catalogued movement, pattern, and opportunity. The first time she fired in anger, the world seemed to hold its breath. A German soldier had wandered too close to a barricade where civilians were hiding. Lyudmila aimed, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. The shot rang out, echoing through the frozen streets, and the man fell. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then reality returned, harsher than before. The fear in her chest was replaced by something heavier. Responsibility. The life she had taken was real. The war was no longer distant. Days blurred into nights, each moment etched with terror and precision. She moved through the snow like a shadow, learning to blend into the environment, to wait for hours in freezing silence, to hold her breath until it burned in her lungs. Each patrol, each skirmish, each observation sharpened her instincts. She was no longer merely Lyudmila Pavlichenko, student of history. She was becoming something else. A ghost in the winter, unseen but lethal, patient but relentless. Her first confirmed kills were small victories, tactical and necessary, but the impact on her psyche was profound. She learned to detach, to see her enemies not as people, but as obstacles, threats to be neutralized with precision and discipline. And yet, beneath this veneer of cold efficiency, her humanity persisted. At night, she wrote letters she never sent, describing the faces of men she had killed, the screams that haunted her sleep, and the unbearable weight of a world gone mad. Her comrades began to notice. At first, there was skepticism. How could a young woman survive, let alone excel in such a brutal arena? But the results spoke for themselves. Lyudmila moved with a patience and precision that few could match. She set traps, ambushed patrols, and eliminated enemy officers with a skill that inspired awe and fear alike. Whispers began to circulate among both Soviet soldiers and German troops. A shadow moves through the forests and streets, striking without warning, vanishing without a trace. They called her Lady Death. With each successful mission, Lyudmila's confidence grew. But so did the danger. She learned to read the signs of enemy hunters, snipers trained to kill snipers. Every shot required calculation, distance, wind, angle, heart rate. Every patrol could be her last. She became a master of patience, often lying motionless for hours, snow melting around her body, fingers stiff and numb, eyes locked on a target she could not afford to lose. The psychological toll was immense. Each life she took weighed on her, and yet, in a paradoxical rhythm, each kill strengthened her resolve. She was fighting not only for survival, but for something larger, justice, revenge, and the preservation of the city she loved. Kiev itself had become a silent mentor, teaching her through its ruins, its terrified citizens, and its haunted streets. She was no longer a student of history. She was writing it with every careful pull of the trigger. In this chapter of her life, Lyudmila Pavlichenko learned the harshest lessons. That courage is forged in the cold, silent moments of preparation. That fear can be transformed into focus, and that the world often underestimates those who appear weak. She was young, yes, but the war had stripped away innocence faster than the snow could fall. By the end of her first month in combat, Lyudmila had already claimed more kills than some seasoned soldiers. Her name was whispered with a mixture of awe and dread, first among her comrades, then among her enemies. But she did not seek recognition. Fame was a dangerous distraction. She moved through the battlefield like a shadow, unseen yet omnipresent, her rifle an extension of her will. And as the snows of winter thickened, covering the city in a blanket of silence and death, Lyudmila Pavlichenko understood a fundamental truth. History does not wait for the hesitant. It is written by those who act, who endure, who survive, and who, against all odds, refuse to be erased. The forests surrounding Kiev were a world unto themselves, silent except for the whisper of wind through frozen branches and the distant thunder of artillery. To the untrained eye, they were merely snow-laden trees, shadows stretching across white landscapes. But to Lyudmila Pavlichenko, they were classrooms, proving grounds, and hunting grounds all at once. She moved through them with a patience that bordered on obsession. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. Her body became attuned to the rhythm of the battlefield, the snap of a twig underfoot, the shiver of frost on a branch, the muted scuffle of boots far in the distance. She was no longer a student of history. She was now a student of life and death in its purest, most intimate form. Her rifle, an extension of her arm, became an instrument of almost supernatural precision. She learned to read wind and trajectory like a composer reads music, predicting how a bullet would dance through cold, dense air before finding its mark. Hours stretched into days as she waited, lying motionless in the snow, face numb, ears straining for the faintest whisper of enemy movement. Hunger and thirst became secondary to patience. Time itself seemed to bend around her, each heartbeat an eternity, each pulse a reminder of mortality. The first major mission that cemented her reputation occurred during the siege of Sevastopol. German patrols had grown bold, confident, and reckless, leaving them vulnerable to a sniper who could vanish into the forest like smoke. Lyudmila had been assigned to a forward position on the outskirts of a partially destroyed village where enemy officers were known to survey Soviet positions. She waited, crouched behind a shattered wall, her breath forming clouds that mingled with the grey morning fog. Hours passed. The sun climbed slowly, casting cold light over snow-draped ruins. Then she saw him. A German officer, pacing, speaking sharply to his men, unaware of the eyes tracking him from the shadows. Her finger brushed the trigger. She inhaled, held, and exhaled. The rifle cracked, sharp against the muted landscape. The officer dropped instantly. Shock rippled through the enemy line, confusion and fear mingling in their ranks. Lyudmila exhaled slowly, feeling a surge of both triumph and dread. Another life taken, another step into legend, another fragment of her own soul etched with winter and gunpowder. Word of the Lady Death spread quickly. Soviet soldiers began to whisper of her in hushed tones, both reverent and fearful. Enemy reports, too, spoke of a shadow moving among them, killing with uncanny precision and disappearing without a trace. Patrols were ambushed, officers eliminated, and the morale of the invaders began to crumble under the weight of invisible menace. Lyudmila's presence was a force that existed beyond visibility, beyond reason, a ghost in the snow. Her missions grew bolder and more perilous. She moved behind enemy lines, often alone, gathering intelligence, eliminating high-value targets, and returning to Soviet positions without ever being seen. Each operation demanded perfect timing, absolute focus, and nerves of iron. One misstep could mean death. One missed shot could cost comrades their lives. Yet even as she mastered the art of the sniper, the psychological toll mounted. Nights were filled with haunted dreams, faces of soldiers she had killed, their final expressions burned into her memory. She kept a small, hidden journal in which she recorded names and numbers, a way to preserve humanity in a world where life was taken with clinical efficiency. Her comrades knew little of her internal struggle. seeing only the lethal precision and quiet composure. But beneath the calm exterior, Lyudmila wrestled with guilt, fear, and the weight of responsibility. The Germans, desperate to stop her, sent their own snipers, trained to track and eliminate other marksmen. Yet they failed. Lyudmila anticipated their movements, predicted their tactics, and turned their own strategies against them. She became both hunter and hunted, moving like a shadow in forests and ruined buildings, her presence felt but never confirmed. Her mastery of camouflage was unmatched. Snow and stone became allies, trees and ruins masks that concealed her intent. One particularly harrowing mission had her lying in the snow for 2 days, watching a heavily guarded supply route. Hunger gnawed at her, fingers stiff and bleeding from cold, yet she did not move. Her target, a German officer coordinating a convoy, stepped into her line of sight. The shot was perfect. The officer fell. Chaos erupted behind him. Lyudmila, numb and exhausted, melted into the snow and disappeared before the enemy could react. It was during these missions that her legend grew to mythic proportions. Soldiers on both sides began to speak of her in awe, some with fear, others with disbelief. How could one young woman move so unseen, strike with deadly accuracy, and vanish without a trace? The Soviets admired her skill, the Germans feared it, and Lyudmila herself wrestled with the paradox of being celebrated for acts that weighed so heavily on her conscience. Yet she pressed on, driven by a combination of necessity, revenge, and survival. Kiev, her city, her home, and her country demanded it. Every life she took, every successful mission, was a small victory against the overwhelming force of the enemy. And each time she returned to her hidden positions, she knew that she had not only struck fear into the invaders, but also written her own name into the unrecorded history of the war, a history the world would eventually forget, until now. By the end of the winter, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had achieved more confirmed kills than almost any sniper in the world. She had become more than a soldier. She had become a legend, a shadow, a symbol of relentless precision and unyielding courage. Yet for her, the battles were far from over. The war would continue, and the forests of Kiev would remain her silent teachers, her battleground, and her crucible. In those forests, she had become more than human and more than myth. She had become the ghost of Kiev, the sniper history would try to erase, yet whose shadow would linger forever in the memory of all who had survived to tell the tale. Winter had not loosened its grip on the eastern front. Snow draped the land like a frozen shroud, concealing the scars of battle beneath its pristine surface. Yet in the midst of the white silence, one presence disturbed the enemy more than any artillery or tank could, the ghostly sniper of Kiev, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Her legend had grown far beyond the forests and ruins of her city. Stories of a young woman, silent as the wind, striking with deadly accuracy, had reached enemy officers and soldiers alike. Patrols were wary, eyes scanning every shadow, every tree, every ruin. Rumors spread through German ranks like wildfire. The Lady Death watches. She sees everything. She knows your heartbeat before you even draw your rifle. Fear, more than bullets, became her weapon. Lyudmila's operations became increasingly daring. She targeted high-ranking officers, enemy snipers, and supply convoys with uncanny precision. One mission took her to the outskirts of Sevastopol, where she spent 3 nights concealed in the ruins of a bombed-out church. Rain and sleet soaked her clothes. Frost bit through layers of wool. She ate little, drank little, and yet her focus never wavered. She observed, calculated, and executed. Each shot was deliberate, each movement invisible. On the 3rd night, a German officer appeared, his uniform crisp against the snow. He carried a map, likely planning a raid. Lyudmila adjusted her scope, breath steady, fingers numb. When she squeezed the trigger, the officer collapsed instantly, a single red bloom staining the snow. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks. Men froze, their eyes darting to every shadow. That night, the legend of Lady Death grew even darker. The Germans, desperate and humiliated, tried to flush her out. Snipers hunted snipers, patrols moved in force, and traps were laid. But Lyudmila anticipated each move. She was always one step ahead, reading enemy patterns like a chess master, predicting 5 moves ahead. For every attack launched against her, she had already prepared a counter, and every counter was executed with chilling precision. Yet even as the fear of her name spread among the enemy, the war took its toll on her soul. Nights were haunted by faces, some of enemies, some of friends lost in battle. The act of killing, though necessary, weighed heavily. Each shot carried the echoes of human life, the shattered potential of those she could not save. She wrote in a small journal, a private testament of the lives she touched and the lives she ended. Her handwriting trembled with fatigue, grief, and determination. Despite her growing fame, Lyudmila remained a solitary figure. She avoided the spotlight, refusing medals or parades. She did not fight for recognition. She fought for Kiev, for survival, for a sense of justice in a world turned upside down. Her comrades revered her, but many didn't fully understand the burden she carried. She was not just a sniper. She was a young woman forced to bear the weight of history in the dead of winter. Eventually, fate intervened. During a mission to intercept an enemy communications post, Lyudmila was injured. She was evacuated from the front lines, her recovery overseen by doctors who marveled at her resilience. The Soviets, recognizing her as a symbol, sent her abroad, not back to the battlefield, but to inspire allied nations. She traveled to the United States, met Eleanor Roosevelt, and spoke before crowds of civilians and soldiers. The young woman who had once walked quietly through Kiev's streets now stood before thousands, recounting tales of courage, precision, and survival. Yet even as the world celebrated her abroad, back home, history began to erase her. The Soviet state, wary of her fame and the independent spirit she represented, quietly minimized her achievements. Official records downplayed her contributions. Her name faded from headlines. While male heroes were immortalized in monuments and medals, Lyudmila returned to a life of relative obscurity, her legend whispered only among those who had witnessed her deeds firsthand. She became a historian, a translator, a quiet figure in the corridors of academia, yet the shadow of her past never left her. On cold winter nights, she would remember the forests, the snow, the crack of rifles, and the faces of those she had sent into silence. She understood that while the world may forget, she could never erase herself from the memory of history she had lived, the battles she had fought, and the courage she had embodied. Decades later, her story resurfaced. Historians and researchers uncovered the records of her confirmed kills, over 300, making her one of the deadliest snipers in recorded history. Documents revealed missions, tactical brilliance, and the relentless courage of a young woman who had refused to be erased by the brutality of war or the indifference of history. Lyudmila Pavlichenko passed away in 1974, quietly, without fanfare. Yet her life, her legend, and her shadow endure. She remains a symbol of courage, precision, and resilience, a testament to the power of determination and the impact one individual can have even when the world tries to forget. Her story reminds us that history is not only written in grand battles and famous names, but also in the quiet, relentless acts of those who stand, unseen, against the tide of destruction. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was that person, a ghost in the snow, a sniper erased by history, yet immortalized by truth. And so, the sniper they tried to erase from history lives on. Not in headlines, not in propaganda, but in the echoes of courage that reverberate through time.